The Call of the Bully, chapter 23, is called A Fight to the Finish. Maybe it was just the way the sun hit it. In the morning light, Skull Rock barely looked like a skull. In fact, there was nothing scary about it at all, and the surrounding woods actually looked green and inviting. As I took down the tent, I noticed some dragonflies circling over the river. You could still smell last night's fire in the cool morning air, and I even managed a brief smile thinking about T-Bone and how everyone had thanked me afterward for running the bikers out of camp. Yes, it should have been a great morning, the best ever, but it wasn't. It was, after all, the day that would decide the fate of Camp Wyoming. If we won the race, it was a day that all future generations of campers would look back on like the 4th of July. They'd probably sing songs about me, maybe even put up a statue. But if we lost, well, I'd be letting down my new friends, Mr. Periwinkle, and every tree, animal, and fish for about 10 miles around. Nothing like a little pressure to start the day. Okay, down to the river, everyone, Mr. Periwinkle called out. Take your spots. Despite Josh having tossed the Algonquin's motor in the fire, they were still beginning the race 4 minutes ahead of us. Sitting there and watching them paddle off was painful. Every second that clicked away on Periwinkle's stopwatch was like a teensy dagger to my gut. I shifted anxiously on my canoe bench, waiting our turn, and looking at Allison. Earlier that morning, I had quietly explained the Moonshine Canal plan to her. Now, as I watched Todd and his crew disappear around a bend in the river, I wondered if the new plan would be enough. 3 seconds, Mr. Periwinkle called, looking at us briefly. Now! This was it. We pushed our canoe off from the shore, jumped in, and we're sinking! Allison screamed. On the bank, I hadn't noticed anything strange, but she was right. The canoe instantly filled with water. There are little holes everywhere, she yelled as cold water came up to our necks. Someone drilled holes in the bottom. We had to scramble out and wade to shore, where Mrs. Lutzkraut greeted us with, My, that was scary. It looks like your canoe is damaged and you're out of the race. Then she clutched at her heart and added, But you're safe and that's what counts. Survival Steve strode up carrying his canoe. Like heck, they're out of the race. Climb aboard, kids. Not so fast, mister. Mrs. Lutzkraut blocked our way. This canoe isn't the same as the others. I'm afraid it's not regulation. Mr. Periwinkle, who seemed unusually calm, remarked, Well, that may have been true in the past, Helga, but I believe things have changed. After I bumped into you last night by the water, I took a closer look at the rules and had a talk with Steve here. He pulled Mrs. Lutzkraut's rule book out from his back pocket. I particularly studied the rule rewrites you've made. Hearing this, Mrs. Lutzkraut opened her purse and fished around for the book. Not finding it, she snarled and attempted to snatch it from Mr. Periwinkle, who flinched and ducked behind Steve. Her face began the familiar twitch that I had always assumed was caused only by me. In addition to the twitch, she bit down savagely on her lip and clenched her fingers into fists. Mr. Periwinkle continued, Good. Now that you seem nice and calm, I want to point out a few interesting little tidbits. You've stated on page 49 that campers now may use personal equipment and that they may alter or change their craft. Also, by allowing the use of a counselor with his own paddle, you've in fact created a case of past precedents, which in turn could be argued that modifications made in the hull material and the internal structure. Silence! Lutzkraut snapped. I can't stand listening to your drivel! Then, looking at me, she barked, Take the canoe! You're already more than 8 minutes back! You'll never catch up! I'm heading down the river, and later at camp I'll be watching Todd, Magnus, and What's-Her-Face cross first. The camp will be mine to do with as I see fit. I'll have the bulldozers get started early. The thought seemed to lift her spirits, and she walked off to join Vanderdyke, who was sitting in the Hummer with the motor running, watching us. He had finally arrived with food just after sunrise, greeted by a mixed chorus of boos and cheers. Steve and Mr. Periwinkle rushed over to help us get situated. Steve said, "You're far behind, but you really do have a chance. This is the finest canoe there is. I made it myself. In just a few strokes, you'll feel the difference." Mr. Periwinkle added, "And remember what I told you. Be careful when you see the grove of white pine trees on the left bank." Allison and I looked at each other. "You didn't tell us anything," I informed him. "And what are white pine trees?" "Well, they're just called that. Eastern white pines, to be exact. Actually, they're green." I was getting a headache and was about to ask how we were supposed to tell these trees from all the others in the forest, but he continued talking. "The trees are on the right, before where the river empties into Lake Waimea, and the finish line. Stay to the left side when you see the white, green pines. The river temporarily forks, and the right side is named Broke Neck Rapids for a reason." "Wait, hold on there." I was suddenly faced with yet another concern. "What's this about breaking my neck?" Mr. Periwinkle wiggled his fingers impatiently. "Nothing to worry about. The river's calm this year, except for that unfortunate incident last month with those 12 rafters." I could feel the blood leaving my face. "But Mr. Periwinkle—" He ignored me and kept talking. "They are, after all, the only 6-class rapids in America, or something like that. Anyways, you're not going down them, and there's a big warning sign. Just stay to the left of the white pine trees, or you're actually—" "Enough!" Steve shouted. "The Algonquins are probably at the camp already. Now get going!" He gave us a hard shove off the bank and into the river's current. This time we stayed afloat. Knowing that we'd have to break every canoe race record, we paddled like demons. I was also aware that Steve hadn't been lying when he said we'd notice a difference. The canoe was super light. It floated higher in the water and glided more gracefully than the aluminum one. If we'd had it yesterday, we'd have zipped right by the Algonquin boat. For a while, we toiled along the winding Dronalot River. The day was already getting hot, and a bead of sweat dripped down into my eyes. I rubbed it away with my shoulder and kept studying the shoreline. T-Bone had told me to look for an old boathouse on the right. After about 20 minutes, Allison spied it. "Josh, paddle up to that shack on the water," I said. The boathouse was crumbling into the river. A section of the roof had fallen and was partially submerged, but the walls still stood on the solid rock footing. We were able to paddle right inside of it. "Is this the finish?" Josh asked. "Did we win?" "No, this is the shortcut. The back wall of the boathouse should open if we push on it." I paddled the canoe till it bumped quietly against the old rotten wood. "This place is creepy," Allison said. I certainly agreed, but I braced the canoe against the fallen roof for leverage and said, "Push!" As the three of us applied muscle, the back wall slid up on rusty hinges, opening just enough for us to paddle under. Even so, we had to bend down in the canoe to squeeze through. Slimy drops of water fell on our hair as we passed under the wall. "There's the canal, I think." "There's the canal, I think," Allison said. I understood her hesitation. The surface of the water was completely covered by a green scum, making it look more like a path than a stream. I took my paddle and ladled some of the murk aside. What lay below was brown and smelly, but it was liquid, and we can paddle into it. The canal was shallow. I could touch the bottom with my paddle, and only about 5 feet across. It was pretty straight and led into the overgrown woods. "Do you think it still connects with the river?" I asked Allison. "Only one way to find out." My instincts were screaming to turn around, but Allison seemed up for the adventure. Having her on board was proving to be valuable, especially when she suggested that we could make better time if she helped push us along the bottom and the sides of the canal. "I just need to find a big stick." We made our way to the side of the canal and held the canoe steady while Allison jumped out and looked around on the forest floor. This should work." She climbed back in with a long, rusty pole that was attached to some rotting wood. We shoved off. It was tough to maneuver at first, since the canal was so narrow, but somehow Steve's canoe seemed to flex through the tight spots and slide easily over submerged logs. I wondered what the canoe was made of. Leaves and branches hung low above us, and we had to push our way through the growth. At times, creepy little critters fell upon us. I knocked one large black bug from the top of Allison's hair before she noticed, and I prayed nothing like that was crawling down my shirt. The thought gave me the heebie-jeebies, and I almost yelled, "Hallelujah!" when I noticed the passage widening up ahead. Escaping the branches and creepy crawlies did little to make me feel better when I saw an old collapsing bridge above the canal. On the bridge, a boy stared down at us. His skin was very pale, which contrasted drastically with eyes so dark and black that they didn't seem to have pupils. He flashed an unnerving smile of greenish teeth, held up a banjo, and began to play. The notes sounded sinister on the deserted canal, and we paddled harder. After we passed underneath, I looked back. He was still playing and still smiling, but suddenly he shook his head back and forth. I shivered. Something didn't feel right. T-Bone had warned me about avoiding the locals, but I wondered how you could avoid anyone along this route. It only went one way, and we were sitting ducks in the canoe. I also realized that nobody in the world had any idea where we were, and traveling down this dark, lonely stretch of water, shortcut or no, was a real bad idea. "Hi," Josh said. Startled, I looked at the left bank. An old man stood there, his arms hanging straight down at his sides. His clothes hadn't seen laundry detergent in years. Neither smiling nor frowning. He just stared down at us. The blankness of his face was oddly terrifying. I nodded at him and tried to look pleasant, but through clenched teeth I hissed at Josh, "Keep paddling." "Hi," Josh said again. More people were walking up. Josh was smiling at them. Of all times for him to work on his social skills. The new arrivals also held blank expressions and wore scraggly, dirty clothes. "Keep paddling." Another guy appeared, leading what looked like a mountain lion by a chain. "Nice kitty," Josh said and held out his hand. This time it was Allison's turn. "Keep paddling, Josh." I could hear the strain in her voice. Mountain Lion Man growled, "You want to come over for lunch?" That made me cringe. What could they possibly be serving? Could it be us? "I'm hungry," Josh said. "No, you're not." Then louder, so that our host could hear, I said, "We'd love to, but we're actually in a race and we have to keep going." The man's face darkened. He spat some thick brown liquid down on a rock. Allison looked nervously back at me. I could think of only one thing to do. "Your shoes untied," I said, looking down and pointing at his feet. His bare feet. Not good. He turned to the growing crowd. "Let's show these folks how we treat uninvited guests." With that, everyone started walking toward us. We were goners. In a flash, I thought of my family and friends back home. They were probably playing volleyball at some picnic while I was about to get eaten by backwoods zombies. "I'd stop right there if I were you." The voice was loud and clear and belonged to Allison. She was standing in the center of the canoe, holding up the long metal rod she had used as a paddle. With a piece of wood attached, it was the dead ringer for a hunting rifle, if you were blind. "Let us be on our way and no one gets hurt." "Sit down, Indiana Jones," I whispered. "And Josh, move it." I pulled as hard as I could on the paddle and we lurched ahead. Expecting to see some maniac or mountain lion in hot pursuit, I was afraid to look back, but Allison's bluff seemed to be working. All three of us were now paddling and pushing as fast as we could, and Steve's canoe had taken on a life of its own. Allison looked back and slowly blew out a large breath. Maybe we had escaped after all, but it wasn't until we broke out into the sun and the fresh swirling water of the Drown-a-Lot River that I breathed my own sigh of relief. Being clear of the murky canal, the dense plants and weird threatening people brought on a wave of joy. I laughed. "Allison, what the heck was that back there? Are you nuts?" "Hey, you inspired me the way you scared off those bikers last night. But anyway, I should smack you with your paddle for taking us in there in the first place. That had to be the worst idea ever, Rodney. She was also laughing now. I listened but held my gaze. Worst idea ever, huh? Yeah, worst idea ever. Look up there and tell me how bad it was. She spun around and I heard her gasp in disbelief. Todd, Tabitha, and Magnus were within sight. It was clear they hadn't noticed us. They were taking their time. I could see Todd pointing at something in the trees. Keep quiet so we can sneak up to them, I whispered. Huh? Josh yelled. I cringed and watched helplessly as Magnus turned around. We were just close enough to see his eyes bug out in surprise. I heard him yell, Good, move in! Their paddles began to hit the water with a renewed fury. Just like that, it was back to the frantic sprint of the day before. They held the lead and weren't worn out from trying to avoid a hillbilly luncheon. But we had Steve's almost supernatural canoe, and it was clear that we were keeping up with them. Unfortunately, we weren't really gaining any ground. For the next hour or so, we put everything we had into it. Steve's special canoe almost seemed as if it was paddling too. I could sense the Algonquins' team growing frustration, that they couldn't shake us, and I began to think a win possible. The idea was just the motivation I needed, for the paddling had become the most grueling thing I'd ever experienced. Every part of my body ached, and I gasped for every breath. My head swirled from the extreme exertion, and I felt an almost dreamlike state come over me, until Allison broke the silence. Look up ahead! I think that's the grove of pine trees Mr. Periwinkle told us about. That's where the river splits. I did see some pine trees in the distance, but we had passed lots of pine trees. Hoping Allison was right, though, I called to Josh. Come on, paddle faster. The finish line should be coming up soon. While my body struggled with the rigors of the race, my foggy senses soaked in views of the mountains and the sharp rocky ledges surrounding us on both sides of the river. The shadowy boulders and wildflowers were very cool, and through my exhaustion I remembered once again why it was so important to win. None of this would be left if Vanderdick and Lootskraut got their way. I even spotted a deer at one point, and a little later a hawk swooped down above us. Rounding out the wildlife visits, a trout jumped out of the water and hit Josh in the side of the head. Hey, fishy likes me, he said, turning around. He was smiling, but his head looked kind of slimy. That's great. How about paddling now? He resumed, and I felt re-energized by our animal cheerleaders. That good feeling lasted until we got closer to the pine trees, and I sighted one more creature on the shore. This one was horrible. It looked hideous, with its strangely colored orange hair, evil eyes, and angry mouth. It saw me and clawed savagely at the air. Hey, look, there's Mrs. Lootskraut, Allison yelled. She was standing next to a big sign with a red arrow pointing to the right. Under the arrow, wet-looking letters declared, Danger! Keep to right! Didn't Mr. Periwinkle say the rapids were on the right side of the pine trees? Allison asked. So much had happened since his early morning talk, and I'd been so confused about the color of the trees that I couldn't remember for certain. All I know, I told Allison, is that I definitely don't trust Mrs. Lootskraut. Mr. Cramps had now joined her, and the two of them were pointing at us and laughing. For the first time, I became aware that the river was starting to move a lot faster. I looked up ahead to see which way Todd and Magnus had gone, and with a rush of panic realized they were nowhere in sight. I'd been too busy looking at Cramps and Lootskraut on the shoreline to notice which course the Algonquins had chosen. Nice try, Rodney! Mr. Cramps yelled into a megaphone. But the best team is about to win! He handed the megaphone over to Mrs. Lootskraut. You've come mighty close! She shrieked, her voice mixing with the terrifying sound from up ahead, the rapids. We were getting close now, but which way to navigate? Mrs. Lootskraut continued. As you can see, you're passing the pine trees, and that means Camp Wyoming and the finish line are under a mile away. You'll never catch them. We were out in the middle of the river. The thunderous roar of the rapids was getting louder by the second. I noticed a subtle current starting to pull us in their direction to the right. Frantically, I yelled, Paddle! I dug my paddle in deep to the right side to push us away. I could see the calm river to the left and couldn't understand why we weren't making any progress reaching it until I noticed Josh. He was busy paddling on his left, which pulled us even closer to disaster. Paddle on the right, Josh! I yelled. Right! Right! He shouted. Yes! He called back and kept paddling on the left. Right! I shouted. I wasn't sure if he couldn't hear me because of the rapids or if he'd gone completely stupid on us. I know! Thanks! He answered. Allison got in the act. No, Josh! Not right like correct! Right like right! Seeing that her words only confused him further, she shouted, Switch sides! Okay. Josh turned around in his seat so that he faced Allison and me, and began paddling backward. I smacked my forehead. By now the canoe was spinning around in circles. I couldn't help but notice Luke's crowd in cramps on the shoreline hooting with laughter. Allison screamed, We're heading into the rapids! I can't swim! I thought you were Miss Doggy Paddle, I said, trying one last time to steer us away from certain death. It was no good. Rodney, do something! The canoe slammed into a boulder and we spun viciously into the fast-moving current. We were done for. I was too scared to do anything other than hang on. It felt like we were on a roller coaster designed by some deranged lunatic who had skipped every safety class at engineering school. We bounced off rocks and crashed down waterfalls. Several times we almost slipped into the churning white water. As I gripped the side, I realized that if we had been in an aluminum canoe, we'd have been crushed like a soda can. The rushing water was so loud that I couldn't hear Allison's screams or my own. I had been in so many tight spots and experienced so many horribly dangerous moments that I should have been used to it by now. But no, I whimpered to myself, this is the most terrifying of them all. That is, except for what happened next. So much water had splashed into my eyes that I could barely see. I was choking on the spray. I could feel the canoe being pulled ever faster along the surface of the water. I temporarily let go with my right hand and wiped my face. I spotted one last waterfall. It was over 10 feet high and I knew we were finished. I tried to yell, Help! But a vicious wave blasted into my open mouth. As I gagged up the water, we shot off the ledge, heading, no doubt, for some jagged rocks below. Instead of falling straight down, though, the canoe caught the air, and we launched forward, momentarily sailing parallel to the river. We came down seconds later like a snowboarder nailing a jump. Instead of fine white powder, however, a spray of foam encircled us. And to my extreme relief, we came out into the calm of Lake Waimea. We're alive! Allison cheered. Great paddling, Rodney! You saved us! I quickly picked up my paddle off the floor of the canoe. Thanks. I can't believe we made it in one piece, she continued. Not only that, I smiled, having spotted something rather spectacular off to my left. We're winning! Josh and Allison turned to port and saw that we were at least 20 feet ahead of Todd's shocked face. This has been a day of shortcuts, Allison laughed. And Steve's canoe was amazing the way it floated in the air back there. I wonder what it's made of. Moose guts, Josh said. He told me about it last night. Allison and I jumped up and wiped our pants, but only for a second. Something had caught her eye. It's just ahead, she shouted. The finish line. Let's get going. We clearly had the momentum. Todd and Magnus tried frantically to catch up, but were no match for the Moose Mobile. Josh and I were able to easily hold them off. Soaked to the bone, as in a dream, we paddled under the big banner that read, Finish. The whole camp erupted into cheers. Everyone was jumping up and down on the floating docks, calling out our names. Well, almost everyone. Surrounded by 6 beautiful girls, Fernando was resting in a lounge chair overlooking the lake. Hearing the commotion, he turned in our direction and raised a glass. Before leaving the canoe, I hugged Allison and called over to Josh. Hey, buddy, we did it! Did what? He asked. We won, Josh, I laughed. Won what? Never mind. High five. The following smack nearly broke my hand, but the intense pain didn't dampen my spirits at all. We had won. We had saved Camp Wyoming. And that is the end of the chapter.